Mr. Dan called me a young judge. When I became a judge 10 years ago, I was in Libya. But you can see that the nature of my job has aged me. That's why I got gray hair as well as a bald head, which means that we have walked ourselves. I want to thank James and the organizers for inviting me to this symposium. I represent the African chapter of the International Association of Refugee Law Judges, where I sit in the council together with James Simba. We have done a bit of work with refugees, and like Ambassador Deng said, we initiated a program with UNHCR in Kenya, where we've trained magistrates and judges on the handling of asylum seekers and refugees, because previously in Kenya, we're in a very unique situation where magistrates were the ones who, by the misunderstanding of applicable laws, would return general asylum seekers to their countries by the invocation of the Immigration Act and the Alien Restriction Act. So that once you come to Kenya and you're taken to court, you're asked one question: are you in Kenya illegally? And you say yes. Then you serve 3 months in prison, and thereafter you go back to your country. So that the judicial system itself perpetuated from. So our training program did help, and right now UNHCR is saying that our training program is unique in the world in the manner in which we have trained our people. South Sudan, our neighbors in Kenya. I come from the north of Kenya, and so I know the effects of conflict at a very close and personal level. But I don't come here as an expert. Neither do I come here with the pretensions that I know South Sudan more than those who come from there, or those that have felt the effects of conflict in Sudan. But I come here as a neighbor and as a judge who's concerned about the plight of those that sit and go through these conflicts, and to offer my support and to offer my thoughts through the symposium on how we can stop these crises that keeps escalating day in, day out. I was asked to speak about understanding the extent and nature of the crisis in Sudan and South Sudan. And yesterday, I think during the introductions, we received, I think, first-hand information about the background and the source of this conflict. I just want to add one thing. In my understanding, the British colonial government, in perpetuation of its policy of divide and rule, decided that North Sudan and South Sudan were strategic but differently in terms of strategy. So that North Sudan, and Khartoum in particular, were looked at as administrative, trade, manufacturing, and politically necessary for its activities, as opposed to South Sudan, which was then used as a space for agricultural production. And it did not matter that there was no connectivity culturally or otherwise between these two regions. For them, it was a policy that would benefit them in the perpetuation of the aspirations of the empire. Later, of course, we received the history about the reason why Sudan, Greater Sudan, had to break up. And beyond the economic and developmental differences between North and South, of course, there is the other aspect of religion. The Arab Muslim communities in the North and the predominant Christian and Black populations in the South. And that divide, whether we like it or not, exists to date. I wish to move and speak a little about the post-CPA. It was expected, I think, that at the signing of the CPA, there will be peace and we will all live happily thereafter. But in fact, the truth is that it did not. And the conflicts that thereafter emanated in Sudan and South Sudan are the reason why we are sitting here today. Look at the conflict in Darfur, and I'm glad Dr. Andy is here. It is said that conflict between semi-nomadic livestock herders and those who were agricultural, and later it took religious and racial lines. Whether that is true or not is a different thing. Yesterday, I think Ambassador Deng spoke about the conflict of identity, where non-Arab Sudanese complain of discrimination by the majority-run Arab government in Khartoum. Look at the fact that that conflict in Darfur went beyond Darfur, and it took a regional dimension, where Eastern Chad also got conflicted into this big conflict in Darfur. We know, of course, that the Doha Document for Peace in Darfur, signed in 2011, partly ended that conflict. But we know that sporadic fighting still continues in that region. You're aware that I come from a country where the President of Kenya, the Deputy President of Kenya, are both indictees at the ICC. The President begins his trial in November, the Deputy President begins his trial in September. That also goes for those in Darfur who are arrested and indicted, including the President of Sudan, Omar Hassan al-Bashir. So that what was initially really just what was said to be a Darfur issue has become a Chad issue, has become an ICC issue, has become an international issue. It's no longer a Darfur issue. We're also aware that other armed groups continue to operate in both countries. In Sudan, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, North, operates in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states. And again, we got the genesis of that fight in the presentation yesterday. South Sudan is combating the South Sudan Liberation Army and a separate rebel group led by David Yao Yao. Both countries accuse each other of funding these rebel groups. South Sudan says you are funding SSLA, and Sudan says you are funding SPLM-N. The conflict continues. I quickly glossed over the armed conflicts because we know them. We know the genesis of those armed conflicts. But nature has a way of also adding tragedy to tragedy. Even as we worry about the armed conflicts, nature itself adds to the disasters in these two countries. Increased desertification has led to greater instances of resource conflict, so that nature itself becomes a source of conflict in the fight for resources in particular areas. We also know that famine and persistent drought in the region are also causing discomfiture in the two countries. What is the current situation on the ground from information that I received? One, there is the issue of repatriation of refugees. You are aware that Kenya holds a large number of refugees, one of the largest numbers of refugees in the world. And there's a need at some point, now that South Sudan has become independent, to return some of these refugees to their countries. By the end of this year, South Sudan, UNHCR plans to return 80,000 refugees. And they also plan that another to Sudan and to South Sudan, 30,000 will go by the year 2013. But even the returnees from the areas that they were living in, the situation remains unstable. It's likely that unresolved tensions between the countries will continue to cause conflict in 2013, particularly in Blue Nile and southern Kordofan states, leading to more displacement and the outflow of refugees from Sudan into southern Sudan. Like I said earlier, violence continues sporadically, of course, in Darfur. We heard from those who come from Abyei that Abyei is still a source of conflict. And it's, unless determined soon, I believe myself that Abyei will continue to be a source of conflict that will continue to cause much more than just the panic around what should happen to Abyei. And I have no answers myself. I'm sure Ambassador Deng, who comes from there, has thought about it much more than me. And later when we come to the question session, you may wish to send all the questions to him and all the comments to me. We also have a safe, demilitarized buffer zone between the two countries. But what about the implementation? It's on paper. Is it being implemented? We also know that as Ambassador Deng said, high levels of insecurity are hindering efforts by the international community to assist victims of violence. For as long as there's insecurity, those who have goodwill to enter those two countries and to assist will be hindered by their own need to have safety. We also have other factors that affect, for example, internees. There is an obvious lack of basic facilities in most areas. Sudan, for example, we know, has one of the worst performing economies in 2012, with high inflation and high unemployment. How do you return people to a situation where their life might be worse than where they came from? Sudan, we know, is under international sanctions. So that Sudan has oil, but its exports have been severely restricted, and that's also affected the south. Today, there are 500,000 refugees of Sudanese origin and 90,000 refugees of South Sudan origin. Both countries have 650,000 refugees. IDPs are many more. There are 4 times more than the number of refugees. Right now, we have 1.2 million residing in Sudan. And the question is, why do you have 4 million refugees, 4 times the number of IDPs as opposed to refugees? And a bit of it was touched on by the facilitator. Both Sudan and South Sudan are large countries by any measure. So that the size itself makes it possible for displaced persons to flee to safety in other regions of the country without leaving that country. It's not like a small country where you run from east to west and you're in the next country. Your own country is big enough for you to run from east to west without crossing borders. Number 2, most displaced persons prefer to flee to nearby areas, wait out the violence. When it subsides, they go back to their home areas. In any event, and more fundamentally, most displaced persons don't have the means to travel long distances to refugee camps in other countries. So again, size of the country matters. Size in terms of where you go, size in terms of movement, size in terms of displacement does matter. The paradox of Sudan is that whereas people are fleeing Sudan and South Sudan, there are people fleeing their own countries into Sudan and South Sudan. So that Sudan has 150,000 refugees from Eritrea, from Ethiopia, from Chad, and DRC Congo. South Sudan has 200,000 refugees into South Sudan from Ethiopia, DRC Congo, Chad, and Central African Republic. Some who are fleeing from attacks by the Lord's Resistance Army of Joseph Kony, who is another ICC indictee. So that as we speak about the crisis in Sudan and South Sudan, and those who are leaving the country or going to IDP camps, we must also worry about those who are coming to these countries, fleeing their own problems in their countries. What then has been the total impact of this conflict in both countries? UNHCR has classified 3 million people as persons of concern, either as refugees, originating from or hosted by the 2 countries, or as IDPs. Beyond what I've spoken about, we also have various threats that these persons face. In Eastern Sudan, there is a risk of trafficking, smuggling, and kidnapping of refugees and asylum seekers. This is an act that has been perfected by Joseph Kony and is being learned by other rebel groups. By kidnapping people, turning them into rebel soldiers, you get armies, you get personnel for your activities. Yesterday, as we were having tea, I spoke with the good professor from Japan about the fact that South Sudanese lost their nationality at independence and they're at risk of statelessness if they cannot prove their entitlement to South Sudan nationality. A lot of people left Sudan, South Sudan when they were young. Much like what happened in Rwanda, when people left in 1959 to go to Uganda, to Kenya and other places. And when Rwanda was liberated, use the word quote-unquote liberated, they wanted to come back. but you've lost your roots. You claim you're South Sudanese, you look like South Sudanese, but where is the evidence of your nationality? And if we become legalistic about nationality and evidence of nationality, very many people can become stateless by that fact alone. And that is another trigger to instability in those countries. The shift in dynamics of the conflicts means that refugees and IDPs become displaced multiple times. You walk into Sudan or South Sudan, and the conflicts, you might walk in a conflict area, and the effect is that you become again displaced multiply, either within the countries or outside the countries. When Abiy fled last year, I spoke at a conference of the refugee law judges in Slovenia. And I said to the judges from Sudan who are there that I foresee that people who have been returned to South Sudan, and if South Sudan flares up again, they might be returned a second time as refugees to Kenya, because there is no security and there is no stability. What you thought to be stability becomes instability. I will not say much about the status of South Kordofan because I'll say something about that. But we have, during the bombardment of those areas, villages were raided, people were detained, women were raped, assaults were conducted. And one interesting story which I would like someone to confirm was the story about education. That during the bombings, because schools were destroyed and daily activities like farming and education were disrupted, teachers and pupils enacted an ingenious way of continuing their education during these bombardments. It is said that it was safer to conduct teaching in the open, so that should there be bombardments and the raids occur, you can run off into some cliff, run off into a cave, run off into a foxhole, and once the bombardment is finished, you come back and continue education. I found that story fascinating. I'm not sure it's true. What about humanitarian organizations? What are their challenges in executing their mandate? We know that the Sudanese government has had strained relations with the international community and has placed restrictions on the movement of non-food items from warehouses and also restricted access to some areas in the past. Sudan would use aid as a carrot. You can access these areas if sanctions are removed. I don't know. We also have instances of carjacking and kidnappings of aid workers. Not as serious as happens in Somalia, for example, and parts of Kenya in the north, but yes, it does. Poor infrastructure. In the concept document you saw, that South Sudan by 2012 had only 60 kilometers of paved roads. That is much like the airport along French Road, Kill Street to the university. You can see the difficulty to reach this huge country without a road network. And I said something at the end of my presentation about that. Poor conditions for refugees and IDPs in Eastern Sudan. Active poverty, lack of access to health care, to education, low employment, little prospects of voluntary repatriation. There's also the issue of persistent drought, shrunk pastures, malnutrition, and so on. There's also the most serious risk, which for me is always very scary. Violent traffickers, smugglers, kidnappers. What is the impact then of the issue raised about returnees to South Sudan? Over 300,000 refugees have returned to South Sudan from neighboring countries since the signing of the CPA. But note that the arrival of these 300,000 has added to the pressure of the country. It continues to experience with regard to IDPs, the hosting of international refugees, the other refugees in the country, and I don't think that South Sudan was prepared for the influx of returnees. But I know for a fact, because I know this from our side in Kenya, repatriation voluntarily remains a good solution to these refugees. I'll jump very quickly and go to my last bit. We are here because we are looking at the ways to intervene. And what we must come up with are interventions that would improve their physical security, living standards, livelihoods, and their resilience. Because they are resilient people. Later in the groups, I will speak about what my thoughts are for the way forward. But since I'm out of time, I wish to just say two things. One, this morning as I was as I was sitting down here, I read something from a man called Kul Manyang Ju, governor of Jonglei State. He said, aid agencies should not be restricted delivering emergency health and nutrition services. Roads must be built to connect counties and communities. So suddenly, we're talking about 60 kilometers of paved roads. People are saying, look, for you to reach us, we need roads. What we take for granted in other countries. Someone else called Toby Lanza, humanitarian coordinator, said, in supporting the world's newest state, we need to help South Sudanese avert crises, not merely respond to them. We must avert as opposed to response. Half the time, 3/4 of the time in the world, we respond, we don't avert. And I think in this symposium, let's find solutions to avert as opposed to responding. My last words therefore are, let us not tire, let us not let fatigue take over. There is still work to be done. Let Sudan and South Sudan remain in a collective radar for the sake of those that require our thinking for their betterment in the future. I thank you for listening.